When my father-in-law left me half of everything he owned, my mother-in-law didn't cry at the funeral. She started making phone calls. I noticed it from across the room, standing next to the casserole dishes and flower arrangements people kept bringing to the house, watching her move from corner to corner with her phone pressed tight against her ear. My husband Daniel had only been gone 11 days. His father, Robert, had passed just 6 weeks before him, a stroke, then a broken heart, the doctors said. And there I was, 31 years old, a widow twice over in the same season, watching my mother-in-law work the room like she was already planning something. I should have trusted that feeling. My name is Claire. I married Daniel Whitmore when I was 26, and from the very first Sunday dinner I sat through in that house, I understood something that nobody in the family ever said out loud. I was tolerated, not welcomed. Daniel's mother, I'll call her Margaret, had a way of smiling at you while saying something that landed like a closed fist. "Oh, Claire, how brave of you to wear that color. Claire, I didn't realize you were still working in retail." Daniel never mentioned it. Always with that smile. Always soft enough that if you flinched, you looked like the problem. Daniel saw it. He apologized for her constantly, which I later understood was its own kind of problem. But his father, Robert was different. Robert would refill my coffee before anyone else's. He remembered that I hated cilantro. When Daniel and I argued, and I showed up at their house with red eyes one Sunday afternoon, Robert was the one who walked me out to the back porch, handed me a glass of lemonade, and said, "You're good for him, Claire. Don't let this house make you feel otherwise." I loved that man quietly and completely. When Robert died, Daniel was already sick. A diagnosis that came too fast, moved too fast, took him too fast. The last real conversation I had with Robert was in a hospital hallway, both of us pretending to be stronger than we were. He held my hand and said, "I've taken care of some things. You're going to be okay." I thought he meant emotionally. I thought he was just being kind. I didn't understand what he meant until 3 months after Daniel's funeral, when Robert's attorney called me on a Tuesday morning and asked me to come in. Margaret found out before I did. I still don't know how, and by the time I walked out of that attorney's office with a folder of documents, I barely understood. My phone was already ringing. It was my sister-in-law, Daniel's older sister. I'll call her Renee. She didn't say hello. "We need to talk about what Dad did," she said. "I just left the attorney," I said. "I'm still trying to. Come to the house Sunday. Mom wants everyone there." I almost said no. I should have said no. But I was 31 and grieving, and I still believed, despite every piece of evidence I had collected over 5 years of Sunday dinners, that these people were my family. That family worked things out. That sitting around a table together meant something. I said yes. The drive to the Whitmore house that Sunday took 40 minutes. I spent most of it rehearsing reasonable things to say. Robert had left me a significant portion of his estate, not all of it, but enough that I understood why Margaret was making phone calls. There was a property on the lake that Daniel and I had always loved. There was a trust that Robert had apparently been building quietly for years. There was a letter, written in Robert's handwriting, addressed to me, that I had not yet been able to read all the way through without stopping. I told myself the meeting would be uncomfortable but manageable. I told myself Margaret was grieving, and grief makes people act outside themselves. I told myself Renee was just protective of her mother. I told myself a lot of things on that 40-minute drive that turned out to be completely wrong. I pulled up to the house and saw 2 cars in the driveway I didn't recognize. I sat in my own car for a moment, looking at them. Something shifted in my chest, not quite fear, more like the feeling you get when you're walking in the dark and your foot finds a step that isn't there. I went inside anyway. The living room had been rearranged. I noticed it immediately. The furniture pushed back slightly, chairs brought in from the dining room, everything oriented toward the center of the space like a stage. Margaret was sitting in Robert's chair, which she had never done while he was alive. Renee was beside her, and on the couch across from them sat 2 men in suits I had never seen before, with leather portfolios open on their laps. "Claire," Margaret said. "Sit down." I didn't sit down. "Who are these people?" They're here to help us work through a complicated situation, Renee said. She used the word us like I was included in it. One of the men introduced himself. He was an attorney. The second man was also an attorney. They represented Margaret and Renee respectively, they said, and they were there to discuss the estate matter and help facilitate a fair resolution. 2 lawyers. In the living room. On a Sunday. I stood very still and looked at the 2 of them, and then at Margaret, and then at Renee, and something that had been soft in me for 5 years, the part that kept giving the benefit of the doubt, kept making excuses, kept showing up for Sunday dinners, went quiet and hard. Dad left you money that belongs to this family, Renee said. He wasn't well at the end. He was on medication. He didn't understand what he was doing. He had 3 separate physicians sign off on his mental competency, I said. I had read that part of the document 3 times. That's something we'd like to examine more closely, one of the attorneys said, in a voice designed to sound reasonable. Margaret leaned forward. In all the years I'd known her, I had never seen her drop the performance entirely, but she came close in that moment. Daniel is gone, she said. You'll move on. You'll meet someone new. You don't need what my husband left you. This is our family's legacy. I thought about what Robert had said in the hospital hallway. I've taken care of some things. I'd like to know, I said, exactly what you're asking me to do. Renee slid a document across the coffee table. It was already prepared, already printed, already organized, with little colored tabs marking the signature lines. They had done this before I walked through the door. They had written the ending before I arrived. We're asking you to voluntarily redirect the assets back into the family trust, Renee said. It's the right thing to do. You were married to Daniel for 5 years. Mom and Dad built this over a lifetime. I looked at the document. I looked at the signature lines. I looked at the 2 attorneys with their open portfolios, and at Renee with her folded hands, and at Margaret sitting in Robert's chair. And if I don't sign? I asked. Margaret's expression didn't change. Then we pursue a legal challenge to the will on the grounds of diminished capacity, and we make sure that process is as thorough and as public as it needs to be. We have records of Robert's medication history. We have family testimony. We have a doctor who treated him in his final year, who has questions about his judgment. She paused. It will take years, Claire, and it will cost you everything you have just to fight it. The room was very quiet. I had spent 5 years being made to feel like a guest in this family. Tolerated, managed, kept at a careful distance while being smiled at across dinner tables. I had watched Margaret rearrange seating charts at holidays to put me at the end. I had listened to Renee make comments about my job, my clothes, my cooking, my background always lightly, always with that same Whitmore smile, always calibrated to land just hard enough that I knew what was meant, without anything being said that could be argued with directly. And now here I was, in a room that had been staged before I arrived, being handed a document with signature tabs already in place, being told to hand back what a dying man had chosen freely to give me. I picked up the document. I looked at it for a long moment. Give me a day, I said. Claire Renee started. I'm not signing anything today, I said. I'll be in touch. I drove home. I sat in my car in my own driveway for a long time. Then I went inside, made coffee, and opened the folder the attorney had given me. Robert's attorney, not the ones in the living room. I read everything, every page. And then I found the letter again, Robert's handwriting, my name at the top. I read it all the way through this time. He had written it 8 months before he died. He told me things I hadn't known, that he had watched what happened in that house for years, that he had conversations with Daniel about it, that he had seen the way I absorbed what Margaret and Renee gave out, and kept showing up anyway. He said he thought that took a particular kind of grace. He said he'd never told me directly, because he didn't want to make things harder between Daniel and his family, but that he had decided to say it this way instead, in the only language he had left. He had also, and this is the part I had not read carefully enough, the first time he had also left me a phone number, handwritten at the bottom of the letter, a name above it, Carol Stanton, Esquire. I called Monday morning. Carol Stanton had been Robert's personal attorney for 14 years. Not the family attorney, his attorney. She was the one who had drafted the estate documents, managed the trust, and apparently had several very detailed conversations with Robert about what might happen when Margaret and Renee found out what the will contained. He anticipated this, Carol told me, on the phone, in a tone that was calm and completely unsurprised. He was very clear about it. We planned for it. What does that mean? I asked. It means, she said, that we should meet. I met Carol at her office 2 days later. She was in her late 50s, small, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and a manner that reminded me of a very polite freight train. She had a conference table covered in organized stacks of documents, and she walked me through each of them with a patience and thoroughness that told me she had been waiting for this meeting for months. Robert had not simply written a will. He had constructed what Carol called a challenge-resistant estate plan. 3 independent physicians had evaluated his mental competency over an 18-month period, not because anyone required it, but because Robert had asked them to, specifically and deliberately, and had their assessments notarized. His medication records, which Margaret had mentioned as a weapon, had already been reviewed by a geriatric specialist who had provided a written opinion that none of his prescriptions impaired his judgment or decision-making. Every document had been drafted, reviewed, signed, and witnessed by multiple parties in a specific sequence, designed to close every door that might otherwise be used to challenge it. He knew they would try, I said. He knew Margaret very well, Carol said simply. He loved her, but he knew her. There was more. The 2 attorneys who had shown up at the house, Carol already knew who they were. One of them had sent a letter to Robert's estate on Margaret's behalf 3 weeks after the funeral. Carol had responded with a packet of documents so comprehensive that they had not replied. She had been waiting to see what the next move would be. Coming to you directly with a pre-prepared document was their next move, she said. It tells us they know the legal challenge doesn't have strong footing. They were hoping to pressure you into signing voluntarily. What do I do now? I asked. Nothing, Carol said. Unless they file, we don't need to respond. The plan Robert put in place is solid. If they file a challenge, we respond. And we have everything we need to win quickly and decisively. She paused. But I'd like you to do one thing. She told me what it was. I thought about it for 2 days. It was not something I would have come up with on my own. It was not something the old version of me, the one who showed up to Sunday dinners and absorbed things and smiled back, would have agreed to. But I thought about Robert sitting in that hospital hallway, holding my hand. I thought about him building this, quietly, for years, without telling me, because he didn't want to make things harder. I thought about Margaret in his chair, with her attorneys and her pre-tabbed documents, telling me Daniel would move on. I thought about the lake house. I thought about what it had meant to Daniel. I thought about what I wanted to do with it. I called Renee. I've made a decision, I told her. She sounded careful, expectant. We'd love to hear it. I'm not signing the document, I said. I want to meet and talk through this the right way. Bring whoever you need to bring. I'll do the same. We set a meeting for the following Thursday. A neutral location, a conference room at a hotel downtown, which I had booked, which had a small adjoining room that nobody asked about. Margaret arrived first, with Renee and both attorneys. They sat on one side of the conference table with their portfolios and their prepared expressions. I came in 2 minutes later. Carol Stanton came in behind me. I watched Renee's attorney recognize her. His expression shifted just slightly, just for a second, but it was enough. He knew who she was. He knew what her presence meant. This is my attorney, I said. Carol Stanton. She represented Robert for 14 years. Margaret looked at Carol the way you look at something that has just rearranged your understanding of a room. Carol set a single thin folder on the table. She opened it. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform anything. She simply explained, in plain and complete language, exactly what Robert had put in place, exactly how resistant the estate plan was to challenge, and exactly what the outcome of a legal filing would be for the estate, for the timeline, and for the expenses Margaret and Renee would incur, pursuing a case that had already been, as Carol put it, answered in advance. Robert was thorough, Carol said, at the end. He had 14 years to be thorough, and he used them. The room was quiet. Renee's attorney was writing something in his portfolio. Margaret's attorney was looking at the table. Margaret was looking at me. I didn't look away. He left you a letter too, I said quietly. I had found out from Carol that this was true. Robert had written letters to each of them as well, held by Carol's office, to be delivered at her discretion. I don't know what it says. That's between you and him. But he thought of you too. He thought of everyone. The meeting ended without signatures, without arguments, without any of the theater I had prepared myself for. Margaret and Renee left without speaking to me. One of the attorneys shook Carol's hand, which I found strange, and then, later, understood. He was acknowledging something. The legal challenge was never filed. In the months that followed, I did things with what Robert left me that I think he would have recognized. I set up a small fund in Daniel's name at the hospital where he was treated, nothing grand, just enough to cover parking costs for families with long-term patients, because I remembered how much those small costs added up during the worst weeks, how nobody talked about them. I kept the lake house. I went there on Robert's birthday and sat on the back porch the way he used to, with coffee, watching the water. Margaret and I haven't spoken since the conference room. I've made peace with that, in the way you make peace with something that was never really what you thought it was. Renee sent me one text, about 6 months later. It said, "I hope you're okay." I thought about that for a long time. I replied, "I am. I hope you are too." We left it there. What I think about most is not the meeting, or the document with the signature tabs, or even Carol walking in behind me. What I think about most is Robert, building something quietly for years, for a person he had decided to take care of, because he had made that decision, and he was someone who followed through on his decisions. He didn't tell me. He didn't make it a performance. He just did it, and left me a phone number. I've asked myself sometimes if I would have found Carol on my own. If I would have read that letter more carefully the first time. If I would have known what to do. I don't think I would have. I think I would have sat across from those attorneys in that rearranged living room and felt everything cave in, the way it always used to cave in, the way years of Sunday dinners had trained me to let it cave. But Robert knew that too. That's why he left the phone number. If you've ever had someone in your life who protected you, without telling you they were doing it quietly, deliberately, in the background, you know what it is to find out about it later. It's a strange thing to grieve, and to be grateful for, at the same time. It makes you want to be that person for someone else someday. I'm working on that. The lake is very still in the mornings. I take my coffee out to the porch, the same way he used to, and I sit with it, and I let myself believe that he knew it would end up this way, that the water and the quiet and the ordinary Tuesday mornings would eventually be mine, and that I would be okay in them. He told me I would be okay. He was right.